Okay, guys, welcome to Module 3. We are going to be going over Lesson 6 today. This is going to be on texture and time and motion. And I know I talked a little bit about texture in our last video. I think I just sort of like double added that for some reason. So we'll do a little review on texture just to kind of catch us up on where we're at, and then also talk about time and motion. I kind of consider these two to be, or the texture and time and motion to be sort of like I don't know, like in betweens of our elements of art and our principles of design, that sort of like bridge the gap between those two. So they kind of don't fit in either of those categories, but they also fit in both the categories, if that makes sense. So to review on texture, texture is the sense of tactility of a work or the feeling of a surface and an object has or appears to have. So like actual texture, that's going to exist in our 3D work and our architecture. That's things that you can actually reach out and touch. Here's some examples of those that we see here and just in our everyday life that are kind of more extreme versions of texture. I mean, everything has a texture to it. Everything is, has some sort of tactility to it in our real world. But you can kind of assume what these different textures actually feel like. We have like a brick wall, we've got like the wood grain there, we've got a cactus. Obviously that texture is going to be kind of extreme, a turtle shell, and so on and so forth. And then the one that's a little bit harder to understand is the implied texture, or a convincing copy or translation of an object's texture in any medium. So when we're implying texture, that means that sometimes we are looking, it can really mean two things. We're either looking at something like this and we're trying to say like, how do we replicate that texture through our art mediums? And here's some examples of an artist trying to create some of those textures, or implying some of those textures that we see. A lot of the time, implied texture can come from a repeat of patterns, or a repetition of pattern that's just replicated over and over again. It can be like the same motion going over and over again, but usually it's something that's done pretty consistently over and over again that start to create that texture, that implied texture. And then the other thing that might exist is that we are just creating texture from our mediums that is like a naturally occurring thing. So think about if you took like a piece of chalk and you ran it through the chalkboard, like turn it on its side, and you just ran it down the chalkboard, it would create this sort of like grainy texture just from the material itself. It's not trying to replicate something. That's just the natural implied texture that it creates. Our artists also call this trompe l'oeil, or in English, tricks the eye, for the first one, at least, trying to replicate a texture that exists in real life. You can also create space using texture, and I don't think I talked about this at the end of our last module, but texture can help define spaces. When it's blurred and lacking a contrast, they can make objects appear more distant, whereas more sharp and strong in contrast, objects appear to be closer. So think about like atmospheric perspective and how we talked about that last time, and how when texture is really fuzzy and kind of unclear, it makes it seem like it's farther away because we see less detail. And then when it's closer to us, we see more like, textures and, what an actual, like the tactility of an object actually is. So you can create or kind of play into atmospheric perspective by playing with some of these things that we know about texture. Another kind of just like specific term here, impasto. This is a term that's reserved for paintings that achieve three-dimensional effects through layers or thickly applied paint. So if you've ever seen a painting that is, or if maybe you have done a painting before, where the actual texture of the paint, the actual texture, not implied texture, kind of builds up and it becomes like a material you can kind of run your hand over and feel the different like layers of depth to it. That's the term for that is called impasto. You could also think about it if you've not experienced this in person, if you have like ever painted with acrylic paints and then left the paints out and it hardens and it like sticks to the palette that way. After it dries, that could be considered like an impasto texture as well. So moving on to time and motion, two kind of tricky things to talk about in a lot of ways, and how we can convey time and motion in our work. So um, time is considered to be the fourth dimension. It is invisible, but it can be made perceptible in art. So if you're trying to tell a story or trying to tell about like a passage of time, you can imply things in your drawings to convey that naturally wouldn't exist in our day-to-day world. For example, we see here this piece is by Stefano di Giovanni. It is the meeting of St. Anthony and St. Paul. So we can see here there's some time elapsing that takes place, and we can pick up on visual cues to understand how this passage of time is happening. We'll talk about what this, like the words for this, are a little bit more in our lesson 7 that we'll talk about in the second half of module 3, but this would be considered directional forces. So I'm kind of briefing you on that term for later on. But we see here the two figures are up here in the corner where my mouse is at, and they move from left to right. They come down here, some time passes, and then we keep following that path, and it's like this little moment of time has elapsed, or maybe a really long period of time, but we're conveying that through showing this road as like a symbol of like a path, or like, a linear progression of time happening, in these 3 sequences. But obviously in our everyday life, we're not going to see like 3 versions of ourselves, just walking and like, on this path. It's something that it can't be, replicated. It's something that just happens in that moment. But in painting, we can convey that meaning. So just to kind of touch on that, with the passage of time, non-Western culture, so this is considered a Western culture painting. It is a like Christian painting, and Western art teaches us that time is linear. So we have our point over here and our point over here, and it's the straight line from beginning to end. Whereas non-Western cultures teach time as being a cycle rather than it being a line. So we see here this example of this Aztec calendar stone, where instead of it just being like, from one end to another, our beginning of our year being right here and then ending over here, or like being over here, ending over here, it's just a circle. It just repeats itself. It continues repeating. We start up here, make our whole way around the sun, and then we're back at the same point again. So it's not something that just has a beginning and end. It's a circle. Another example of how we see a passage of time, or we're able to tell stories through implying time in art, is the advancement of, or not advancement, but the idea of comics. So comics teach us to read them as we would read like a book. So we've got our story starting here at the top left, and we read it from left to right and then down and starting over again, because that's how we've been trained to read books. So we know that this passage of time goes in this specific order because of what we already know. And that's just something that artists are able to sort of play on and have played on. Now, motion, kind of similar to the idea of time. It's something that's hard to capture in like a still moment, but we can do it within art. So this example here is implied, or when we have like sculptural work, we also have performance art and things like that as well. But if we're implying motion, it's meant to give like a lifelike feeling of something and making it feel more real to us. So this is an example of showing motion in like a still artwork. It's the dancing Krishna, and portrays the Hindu god as a playful child. So another thing I'm kind of introducing you with again is the directional forces and how we use those to create this like dynamic sense of motion. Directional forces will tell us that when we've talked about this a little bit with line as well, that diagonal line is or directional forces that are diagonal are very unstable. They are in motion. They are not still, stable moments. And in this piece, all of the lines that we see being used are diagonals. If I had like a marker that I could kind of draw through some of these lines that are happening in the body, we would see there's one going across this way, across this way, across this way, and they're just sort of all over the place. So that's telling us this activity, or this movement that this person's doing is not a still position. Some more examples of motion and time in two-dimensional art. We see this piece that you've probably seen before. It's Under the Wave of Kanagawa, or The Great Wave by Hakusai. And we can tell here that those directional forces are all kind of just like, whichever way, diagonal happening. And it's showing this like intense scene and motion moment. Some more examples that we see here. And this is the dynamics. I can never say this. The dog on the leash. We see that there is actually this other thing that we haven't seen in the previous examples, which is sort of like what's the word I'm looking for? We have a still of the dog, and we can see that like there's a part that's like more outlined, more kind of like heavy-handed. And then we've got like these little sort of fragmented pieces that are happening off of it that are showing that its legs are moving really, really fast, and that this woman's legs beside of him are moving really, really fast. And that's a good way to show motion as well. It's a little bit messier and less like clear cut, but it does give across the idea that there is motion happening here. Another example is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, where we have that like fragmented stills kind of paired together to show that there's this movement happening. This one's a little bit more abstract, so I'd understand if you don't get it or get it initially, that there is like a person supposed to be going down the stairs, but just kind of imagine for a second that there is this body moving down the staircase, and we're capturing each little moment, each little pan of that motion happening before us. Think about like the like stop motion animation from like Wallace and Gromit and Chicken Run and all those old movies, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and how each little still moment has to be like adjusted within the characters. And imagine just clipping all of those moments together all at once and overlapping them. It might look something like this. Another example of motion in work. This is The Horse in Motion. This is our first example of like video work as well, and understanding what video was or is. And it's essentially just all of these photographs taken in succession and then paired together and rolled on film to create the appearance of film being captured. But really, it's just like lots of photographs photographed one after the other, and that's how film originated. If you guys saw the movie over the summer, Nope, it's the Jordan Peele movie. They use this example as well to show like the first example of video or of movies and animation. But it's more about the writer in that. Just a little side story. Just some more examples here that we've got. This is the I cannot say that word. This is Cyclist, and it's obviously very abstract, but we can see that they're kind of, taking some artistic liberty with the motion and in the colors and the lines to imply this sort of like, unstill moment. And this piece is really interesting, I think, as well. This is at the Guggenheim Museum, and the piece is actually running through. So the text that we see here is running around the gallery and telling us a story. But we have to really pay attention to like when this starts and ends, because it's just constantly moving around, going up different levels, and creating literal motion for us to experience. Alrighty. So that is it for lesson 6 for us. We'll jump back into our next video for lesson 7. Might be a couple parts to lesson 7 because the principles of design are pretty dense content. So I will see you guys then, and I hope you enjoyed the video.